The Awakening from the Fempiror Chronicles by George Willson. Chapter 13. The Council. Zechariah and David entered the immaculate council body hall and walked directly across the foyer to a room on the left labeled Main Council Hall. Zechariah maintained his fast pace, and David still had to run at times to keep up with him. David followed Zechariah into a large room that spanned the entire side of the building. Windows adorned three sides of the room, all of which had internal shutters that were currently open, as the sun would not be up for a few hours yet. It looked similar to the design of the town hall in Hogginstown, with a series of seats at the back of the room for spectators, some benches near the front for people involved in the proceedings, and then an elevated platform with a long table across the front of the room for those in charge. They entered into the space between the spectators' seats and the benches, and Zechariah led David past the front row of seats, which spectators had already filled, to the center aisle. As they walked past the crowd, whispers fluttered through the rows. "It's Zechariah. Stirring up trouble, I hear. Now I know what this is about." Zechariah reached the front bench and sat down to wait. David saw that besides the door they had come in, there was one other entrance to the hall at the front of the room to the right of the raised platform. He also noted two Fempiror posted at each door. They were dressed in black, loose-fitting clothing, and armed with swords strapped to their backs, much like Zechariah. David could not help but wonder if these guards, or warriors, were normal for a meeting such as this. At the front of the room, the long table had 7 chairs behind it, accessible primarily from the front door. He presumed these chairs would soon hold the 7 people he had seen in the portraits upstairs. Each seat had a nameplate before it. He found Vladimir at the far left side of the table, and Head Korean's name was in front of a raised seat in the middle. Between Vladimir and Korean, from left to right, were Jatarua and Tyronis, and from Korean to the right end of the table were Oligar, Virna, and Gitish. None had any last name or label listed. "What's going to happen?" David asked, worried. Zechariah appeared very calm, as if he already had the situation well in hand. "This will be a simple, formal meeting," he said. "A Fempiror will enter through that back door behind the table and announce the council. Everyone in the room will stand. Then they will enter one at a time through that same door in the order of their names on the table. Head Korean will tell us all that the council convenes and will ask everyone to sit. From there, he'll tell everyone why we're here, while no doubt throwing in a disdainful word for me before he turns the meeting over to me for a moment to explain myself. After I've explained, they'll question me, though they'll more likely interrupt during my story to get the meeting over with quicker. Now, I will introduce you, but you won't have to say or do anything. You're here primarily as evidence, and I will not bring you forward to speak. They also won't question you like Tiberius did. You have nothing to worry about." "What about you?" David asked him quickly. Zechariah glanced at him and smiled. "Don't worry," he said again. "I'm used to this. I was up there for a long time, so I can handle them." Zechariah sighed. "But, truth be told, this may not go well. You need to be ready to leave when I tell you to leave. Stay with every step I take. You may have to use some of that newfound strength you now possess." David nodded and looked at the crowd behind them. Tiberius had just entered and taken a seat near the back. He gestured to David to look forward. David did, and saw Zechariah's description of the ceremony come to life. An older man entered from the chamber doors at the front. He was dressed all in white, right down to his shoes, with a white dress wig. "Velen nedsta, telnyato par kunliskilero Fempiror," the man said. Zechariah quickly leaned over and translated, "All rise for the entry of the Fempiror Council." Everyone in the room stood as 7 Fempiror walked through the door at the front. David recognized Vladimir as coming in first. The Fempiror walked in a line in the order of the nameplates from left to right, each going to one of the 7 chairs at the head table. All of them were men who looked to be about the same age, and each of them, with the exception of Korean, were dressed in the same blue and yellow that Vladimir had worn earlier. Korean wore a crushed velvet purple robe and hat with gold where Vladimir's was yellow. "Kunliskil jikortia, iresta sats," Korean said. Zechariah translated quietly for David again. The council now convenes. Please sit." And on cue, the entire room sat down. Head Korean leaned forward, his hands folded before him. Neither he nor any of the 5 members of the council that David had not met appeared very happy to be here today. Vladimir's expression was solely that of concern as he kept his eyes on Zechariah. Zechariah still appeared completely calm. This was his arena. "We are here for an emergency meeting called by Zechariah, Rostem, and former member of the council, removed for unfounded theories and disturbing the peace," Head Korean began. He had no notes or information before him. He delivered this solely from memory. "Zechariah, I do hope you haven't called us all here in vain." Zechariah stood up and stepped confidently before them. "I assure you, Head Korean, that I have not," Zechariah said. "I have with me one David Taylor, a former resident of Hoggenstown, which I currently protect. He was recently transmutated by a Fempiror named Rufus, who claimed allegiance to the Tepish order." The crowd reacted to the forbidden word. Zechariah waited a moment to allow his words to sink in. The council sat quietly and waited for Zechariah to continue, not reacting to either Zechariah or the audience. Zechariah continued, "The Tepish have existed for years in this capacity, but have not been a threat. However, this Tepish claimed to be a Redel Kurtz, the second rank of the Tepish hierarchy, and in a capacity not of command, but of acquisition." "And why is that significant?" Tyronus interrupted. Zechariah looked at him. He had prepared this answer since it would be the most obvious. "If you were an independent member of a dead order, why claim to be a middle rank? Why not say you are the Elrod Malnak instead, or one of the other Malnak?" "It was the nature of the Tepish to instill fear," said Oligar, "even those who work alone. What better way to make one believe there are more than to say you are outranked?" "But the Tepish do not kidnap their victims," Zechariah countered. "They leave them to be rejected by their families, so something is going on to make them depart from their traditional actions." "I am not convinced," Virna said flatly. "What proof do you possess other than this boy who could have been changed in any of a dozen ways?" Zechariah chuckled under his breath. David thought he heard Zechariah mutter, "Always the cynic." "I have this," Zechariah said, raising his voice again. David caught Vladimir closing his eyes with a stifled sigh as Zechariah opened the small Nilrov satchel at his side. He carefully pulled the smashed Nilrov out of its satchel and held it aloft before the council. "This is what remains of the very Nilrov used by the Tepish to change David, as well as another man from Hoggenstown, into Fempiror. It was unfortunately destroyed when I saved David, but why would a lone Fempiror possess such a thing?" Zechariah turned and displayed the Nilrov to the crowd behind them. "The Tepish are returning. They were taking David to be part of an unwilling army, and when they are ready, they will attack and lay waste to everything." The crowd reacted again, but more intensely. Zechariah was getting to them, and when David looked back at the men sitting at the head of the room, he could tell they were reacting as well. Zechariah still sat calmly and only stared at Zechariah, amused. Getish was not so silent. "Zechariah, you are getting out of order," Getish declared. "My apologies, Council Head," Zechariah responded, "but this is serious." "You claimed this urgency 25 years ago," Korean said while retaining his usual calm, which was quite different from his demeanor earlier. "When you led our waning army to a desolate zone and found no evidence of Tepish or even recent departure. This Nilrov is a useless relic. If I am not mistaken, the Nilrov that led us out there to begin with is still in the possession of a former Rostem leader. You would assert that if someone happened to cross this item in his possession, we should try him as a Tepish as well." "Not at all," Zechariah said, taken aback. "And yet, you place much weight upon this find because you do not know the history of its owner," Korean continued. "I saw him change David," Zechariah insisted. "One Fempiror does not make an army, and you've already indicated that he was dealt with under the code," Korean said. "We hold your further Tepish claims as unfounded." "What proof do you require?" Zechariah asked angrily. "You will accept nothing short of invasion as proof. Then you will call it isolated, sit quietly in your comfortable seats, and be slaughtered." "Zechariah, that is enough," Korean said, losing his stoic expression. "Be silent." "I will not be silent," Zechariah replied. "I will not stand by and watch you allow my people to be destroyed from within." Vladimir leaned forward and pleaded with Zechariah. "Zechariah, please." "No!" Zechariah yelled. Vladimir sat back quietly in his chair and shook his head. "This council no longer governs in the best interest of the people," Zechariah continued. "Your leadership is worthless because you do not lead. You have forgotten whom you serve. You are all lambs awaiting your slaughter." Korean stood up. Clearly this was what they had been prepared for. "We cannot allow you to stir the people with this non-existent Tepish threat," he said. "You are under arrest. Seize him." The 4 guards in the room moved suddenly and quickly. David had forgotten they were there as they had been standing so still and silent throughout this ordeal. They drew their swords as they closed in on Zechariah. Zechariah replaced the smashed Nilrof into its satchel and moved to a defensive position. He drew his sword and gestured for David to get behind him. "Do exactly as I say. No questions," he said quietly. David nodded, fearful of what appeared to be happening. He was not about to question Zechariah at this point. He had no idea what Zechariah had in mind, or how they were going to get out of this mess. He could only hope Zechariah actually had a plan. Zechariah moved with unreal speed, and the clang of swords striking together rang through his ears. He watched as Zechariah only blocked the strikes of the 2 guards closest to them. The other 2 were right behind them and quickly moving around to flank Zechariah on either side. It was a 4-to-1 battle, and he doubted even Zechariah could hold off all 4 of them for long. David did what he could to stay behind Zechariah and not become a victim himself. The warriors backed them towards the wall of the room, and soon they would be trapped. Suddenly, Zechariah turned and leaped out the window, shattering the glass and landing softly on the ground outside. David followed suit behind him. The cool night air was a refreshing change to the stifling atmosphere of the council hall. A quick look around revealed them to be in an alley between the body hall and the building next door. Another door on the side of the body hall led into the lower level, but he felt that if they were coming after Zechariah, this door would prove to be an outlet for more of those guards. The main road was only yards away in one direction. Behind them was another, lesser-traveled road. Zechariah took a few steps towards the lesser-traveled road, but 4 guards entered the alley from that direction. Zechariah turned to the main road and saw 4 more guards entering the alley from there as well. Adding to the chaos were the 4 guards leaping out the window from the council room into the alley, and the door from the lower level was also opening. They were trapped. Then Zechariah looked up. "Hold on to my neck," he said with some urgency. David looked at him incredulously. "What?" he asked. "I don't have time to explain," Zechariah said quickly. "Just hang on and keep your feet off the ground. You'll be strong enough to hold yourself on." David nodded. "I understand," he said, but in reality he did not understand. Zechariah had told him without question, so David complied. He jumped onto Zechariah's back, wrapped his arms around Zechariah's neck, and curled his legs off the ground. Despite the fact that he was now holding his entire weight, he barely noticed. Without a word, Zechariah leaped upwards an impossible distance onto the wall of the council body hall. David could not fathom a logical reason for this. The wall was brick, but there was no handhold or anything else that would allow Zechariah to use a leap to the side of the structure, no matter how high up he was able to jump. But Zechariah only paused for a fraction of a second on that part of the wall before he leaped to the wall of the building on the other side of the alley, which was more of a typical wood and stone construction, landing several feet higher. Zechariah had planned his course carefully up the wall to land in between the windows of the 2 buildings as he went up. Zechariah paused for the same fraction of a second before leaping again to the wall of the hall, several feet higher again. This back and forth leaping continued up the entire height of the walls, but when David looked down, he saw that some of the guards were following them up the wall in the same fashion. He also saw other vehicles at ground level that were levitating above the ground at about the height of the levicart, but were only wide enough for a single person to ride. These must be the chasers described by Tiberius. Before he knew it, they had leaped the entire 3-story height of the buildings and landed on the roof of the building next door to Council Body Hall. Zechariah turned his head to David. "Get down," he said. "I'll protect you. Just stay behind me." David complied, and hid behind Zechariah just as the first guard appeared over the edge of the roof and rushed Zechariah. Their swords clashed briefly. The guard was spirited, but clearly inexperienced, as Zechariah beat his parry easily and ran him through. Two others followed immediately behind him, and Zechariah blocked and parried their blows, somehow managing to fend off both attacks simultaneously. The guards appeared to be fighting their own battles without working together to throw Zechariah off at all. He blocked blow after blow, not attempting to gain any ground with them until he had worked himself to where one was behind the other. At that moment, he easily felled the one closest to him. The second one rushed in immediately, but he failed to consider Zechariah's skill, and his body hit the ground before he could raise his sword. As he fell, Zechariah grabbed the second guard's sword and held it ready in his left hand. The guard's long, straight sword looked rough and even ugly in comparison to the sleek, thin curve of Zechariah's handcrafted weapon. Before they could even move, 3 other guards had replaced their fallen comrades, and now with a sword in each hand, Zechariah was battling all 3 of them at once. As with the previous pair, they were not a coordinated group, and Zechariah was easily able to defend himself despite the uneven odds. He moved in close to the first one, made a quick block, and kicked him off the roof. As he blocked a blow from the second one, he repositioned himself and blocked a blow from the third. The second made another attempt, and Zechariah quickly twisted his sword, throwing the second one's sword clean off the roof as a blow from the third was blocked. With the sword of the third occupied for a second, Zechariah ran him through before he could draw back for another blow. The second guard had backed off, being without a sword. Zechariah sheathed his sword and turned to David. "Let's go," he said quickly. Zechariah sprinted off again, twisting the extra sword in his left hand to point downward as he ran. David ran behind him, staying to Zechariah's right to avoid his extra sword. Several more guards leaped over the edge of the building and gave chase. Zechariah leaped from rooftop to rooftop, quickly moving through the town. David worried that he would be unable to keep up, but he was able to follow Zechariah perfectly. Every leap was more than sufficient to clear the distance between the rooftops, and Zechariah never faltered for a moment. For a man of over 400 years, he was remarkably agile, and David was able to stay with him. Suddenly, Zechariah leaped to a lower roof and then skipped off the roofs entirely to the ground, where he landed with a soft thud. David landed behind him, but rolled to a stop. Hardly pausing, Zechariah ran to where he had parked his levicart nearby. He must have intended to reach his levicart from the roofs, so he didn't have to deal with the people below slowing him down, or more likely, the chasers catching up to him. David jumped to his feet, realizing how winded he was from the pace, but he caught up to Zechariah. Zechariah stopped next to the cart and dropped the extra sword in the back seat. David suddenly realized he had lost his hat at some point during the sprint. He glanced behind them to see if he could spot his hat, but it was nowhere in sight. He had no time to wonder where he had lost it, however, as the chasers were coming. They both jumped into the cart. Zechariah started it up, and in no time at all, David saw why Zechariah had ultimately parked the cart where he had before the meeting began. Directly ahead of his levicart was a long alley that led straight out of town into the fields they had crossed earlier. Zechariah threw a switch, pushed forward on the controls, and the cart blasted out of Aram. David looked behind them, and 4 chasers had turned down the alley and quickly gained on them. The levicart hit the open fields, and Zechariah pushed the levers forward as far as they would go. The landscape rushed by at a blinding speed. Once their eyes adjusted outside the bright lights of Aram, the light of the moon helped to illuminate their path more than sufficiently. David glanced back and saw that the chasers were gaining on them. "Listen, I need you to maintain a straight course unless there is an absolute need to change direction," Zechariah said. David looked at him, surprised. "You want me to do what?" "They're going to be on us in a very short time, and I need to get rid of them. You need to control the levicart." "I don't know how." "You've seen me do it, right?" Zechariah asked. David was panicked. Of course he had seen the simple controls of the cart, but it was one thing to see it, and another entirely to do it. "David," Zechariah said curtly, "you can do this." David nodded. Zechariah climbed out of his seat and into the back of the cart. The controls stayed in their forward position. David looked forward. The fields were clear for some distance, but there appeared to be a forest that would soon run parallel to their course. With a deep breath, he climbed into Zechariah's seat and held the controls. He pulled back slightly and felt the cart slow just a little under the reduction of propulsion power. He pushed the controls forward again and felt the cart speed back up as the power was reapplied. He breathed heavily and looked back to Zechariah, who was eyeing him with a slight smile. "Forgive me for not giving you a lesson sooner," Zechariah said. "I didn't think you'd need to drive after only 3 days." David shrugged. "As long as I just need to go straight, I can do it," he said, more for himself than for Zechariah. Zechariah nodded. "Just stay the course," he said. "They're almost upon us." Zechariah stood in the rear of the leva cart and looked at the field behind them. The chasers continued to gain on them. Zechariah slipped his foot through one of the straps attached to the rear bed of the cart. He leaned down and tightened the strap. He picked up the sword he had taken from the Fempiror guard on the roof in his left hand, and drew his own sword with his right. 2 of the chaser Fempiror drew their swords and held them horizontally level with Zechariah's neck. Zechariah held his swords vertically in front of him and placed a leg back to brace himself for the inevitable impact. The chasers reached them, and their swords clashed against Zechariah's defense. The leva cart shuddered under the force of the hit. David flinched while holding the controls, and the cart swerved slightly. Zechariah appeared to be unmoved by the strike, and only moved under the leva cart's instability. The chasers spun out of control, each going opposite directions, but their riders soon regained control and circled around to approach the cart again. The other 2 chasers attempted to seize the moment of the leva cart's slowing and separated, each to one side of the cart. They were moving in quickly in an apparent attempt to pin the cart between them. Zechariah leaned forward to David. "Speed up when I tell you to," he said. David nodded and glanced to each side. The chasers were closing fast. David's hands rested gently on the controls, waiting for Zechariah's signal. "Now," Zechariah said. David pressed the control levers forward as far as they would go. The leva cart shot forward in an instant. The riders quickly righted their chasers, but they were unable to control their momentum and collided just behind the cart. One of the riders hit the ground as the rigs crashed together, but the other rider used his own momentum to leap from his falling chaser onto the back of the speeding leva cart. Zechariah struck instantly, but the rider blocked the blow with a wrist gauntlet before clutching both of Zechariah's hands, preventing a second blow. The 2 stood at a stalemate on the back of the cart, with neither able to deliver a punch without the other stopping it. Zechariah brought his knee up into the rider's gut, and then punched him in the face when he faltered, but the rider maintained his grip on Zechariah and did not fall. Zechariah glanced behind the rider to see the other chasers approaching them swiftly from behind. They held out their swords at neck level again with no regard for their fellow rider. Apparently Zechariah was dangerous enough that if they could take him out, killing one of their own was of no consequence. Zechariah only held the rider at bay, stopping his various kick attempts with leg blocks of his own while he awaited the inevitable strike. The other chasers rushed upon them, and Zechariah ducked at the last moment. His opponent never saw it coming, and a head dropped into the seat next to David. David jumped involuntarily, and then grimaced at the blank eyes staring at him. Zechariah sheathed his sword, removed the scabbard of the dead rider, and discarded the rider's body and head over the side of the fast-moving cart. In front of them, the other chasers wheeled around and charged them from the front. Zechariah sheathed the extra sword and leaned down to David again. "Head to the forest," he said, pointing to the large grove of trees that David had seen earlier. David shook his head. "Are you crazy?" he asked rhetorically. Zechariah looked forward. The pair of chasers was on the verge of ramming them. "No time to argue," he said, placing his hands on top of David's, and quickly steering the cart directly towards the trees. The chasers missed them by inches, and spun round to follow. "We'll smash against a tree at this speed in the dark," David panicked. "You're a Fempiror," Zechariah said reassuringly. "Relax, and use your reflexes. They're faster than you think." David took a deep breath. This was another time where he could not argue, and there was no time to consider anything. Zechariah had made this decision for him, and with the edge of the forest looming, there was no turning back. As they flew into the trees, David quickly learned that the slightest move to the control levers could make a big difference in speed and direction. He also found that keeping up with the speed of the cart as it whipped through the trees was not as difficult as he had imagined. Zechariah had thrust something upon him that he could handle, and unless Zechariah had forced him to handle it, he would not have believed it. But there was little time to marvel at his newfound skills. The other two chasers were just as capable of maneuvering through the trees, and they proved it as one of them settled directly behind the cart. Something clanged against the rear of the cart, and its speed lurched slightly. David looked quickly behind them to find that the chaser had a hook attached to the rear of the cart, and the rider was pulling himself closer. The rope was attached to the chaser just below the handles in front, where there appeared to be a small compartment large enough for the rope and hook assembly, and the compartment blended with the body of the chaser when closed. Zechariah was already watching the unwelcome visitor closely, waiting for him to close in on them. Suddenly, Zechariah leaped from the back of the leva cart and landed on the chaser, sitting face to face with its rider. The rider was momentarily stunned, and provided very little struggle against Zechariah, who threw the rider off his chaser in short order. Zechariah turned himself around, detached the rope from his chaser, and flew through the trees after the other chaser, who had been keeping pace off to one side, waiting for his partner to capture the leva cart. Zechariah drew his sword and settled near the other chaser on his right. The rider switched his sword to his left hand and was able to fend off the few blows that Zechariah was able to make between the trees. Zechariah slowed the chaser slightly, much to the surprise of the rider, and resheathed his sword. He whipped the chaser between the trees and settled behind the rider. With a burst of speed, he rammed the chaser from behind. The rider swerved, but Zechariah stayed tight on his tail. He held his sword at the ready, watching for Zechariah to come again. Zechariah sped up and rammed the other chaser again, but as he hit, he turned to the right, causing the rear of the other chaser to follow. Through a combination of one hand holding a sword and the tight concentration of trees, the rider had no chance of recovery. His chaser spun uncontrollably, crumpling the rider and the chaser into a tree. Zechariah flew to David and signaled for him to slow down. David gratefully complied. Zechariah stopped next to him and stepped off the chaser. He regarded it for a long moment. David stared at his thoughtful face. "What is it?" David asked. "What are you thinking?" "I was just considering how useful an extra vehicle might be for us," Zechariah replied. "What are you going to do with it?" Zechariah shrugged. "You never know," he said. He used the rope and hook that the chaser's former rider had used to grab the back of the cart, and tied the chaser to the rear of the leva cart. When it was secure, Zechariah retook his place at the controls, turned them around, and flew out of the wood back into the open fields again. Once free of the trees, Zechariah pushed the acceleration to its limit again and steered them west. "Karebdim?" David asked. "That's the plan," Zechariah answered matter-of-factly. He reached behind the seat and picked up the newly acquired sword. He looked at it for a moment and sighed. Finally, he handed it to David, who took it impulsively. "This will be yours," he said. "Tiberius or I will teach you to use it. Traditionally, you would make your own, but we don't have time." David looked at the sheathed sword. He had never seen a fight like this before today, and unlike the non-threatening environment of Tiberius' padded floor, this was far too real for him. He did not move to remove the sword from its scabbard and looked to Zechariah. "I don't know if I want this," he said. "I know," said Zechariah. David placed the sword back behind the seat. Zechariah sighed. "If you had not been attacked, you would be at home, safe and ignorant of everything you know now. You are now a part of a different society, and in this time and circumstance, no one has a choice." "It's not that I don't appreciate it," David said. "You have been good to me, but you have to understand that where I grew up, we had no conflict. I've never seen anything like this. It's too much. I didn't think... I'm a tailor. That's how I grew up. It was never within my future to kill." "Taking a life is not part of anyone's future," Zechariah reassured. "I did not go to Aram to kill. I went to talk. I did not want to do what I had to do. If they had not pursued us, I would not have pursued them. If they had not threatened our lives, I would not have taken theirs. If there was any other path, I would have followed it. But if I had not killed them, they would have killed us." David nodded. Of course, Zechariah was right, but accepting that sword would be accepting something foreign to him. Maybe it took a younger Zechariah time to adjust to the idea of death, but David just could not do it. He had been forced to accept so much in the last couple of days that, for the sake of his sanity, he could not deal with this right now. The day might come when he had no choice, and he would accept the life that Zechariah proposed, but at this time he could not do it. Besides, the trip through the trees had been a real eye-opener for him. He knew that only a few days ago, if someone had placed him at the controls of the Levicart and asked to fly through a grove of trees at that speed, he would have crashed. The thought continued to boggle David's mind when he considered that only a few days ago he was completely unaware that something like a Levicart existed. The fastest mode of transportation he was aware of before meeting Zechariah was riding on horseback, and horses were a rare occurrence in Hogginstown. No one needed them for anything. There were some farmers on the edges of town who used them occasionally, but more for hitching a cart to them and moving their wares into town. Speed was something unnecessary in his former world. He looked back at the land rushing past them. Now speed was a part of his life. A part of a life he was stuck in, but really wanted no part of. A life he was constantly searching for any way to get out of. He knew he could go home, ready by Fempiror standards or not. He was sure they would accept him. He was sure it wasn't all lost to him forever. He did not want to wait. However, looking at the horizon and seeing the first rays of sunlight show themselves, he felt a twinge of panic, and really wondered if he could go home with this sort of a problem. He was already learning what it was like to be a Fempiror, to be afraid of the sun, and he began to second-guess himself for the first time.